Freedom Counsel is nothing without all of you. How do we go about getting people held criminally responsible for their acts? The military is still at risk. Election interference, the medicalization of childhood. These drug dealers like Pfizer and Moderna, we can seize their property. We develop our litigation through conferences like this. It's going to come through communications. It's going to come through conversations. And Freedom Counsel is that conversation.
For information, visit freedomcounsel.org.
You just have to flood a country's public square with enough raw sewage.
And if anybody is lying here, Senator, it is you.
Once they lose trust in their leaders, in mainstream media, in political institutions, in each other, in the possibility of truth, the game's won.
With Broken Truth, I am John Davidson. This is a Freedom Counsel interview, and Warner, unfortunately, is out today. And today we are discussing the ACIP situation that has been unfolding for the last few weeks, the CDC's Vaccine Recommendation Authority. And today we have Kim Mack Rosenberg, who is an excellent attorney with Children's Health Defense. She's General Counsel. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here, John.
So, Kim, can you kind of summarize the situation, the different cases involved, and who the players are?
So there are two main cases going on. The first is a case that Rick Jaffe, who is the outside counsel that we're working with on both the matters we're going to be talking about, a great, great attorney, has filed and has been involved in. The first is a lawsuit in which Children's Health Defense is actually a plaintiff, along with 3 families and 2 doctors, where we are suing the American Academy of Pediatrics for RICO violations. The second case, so that case is ongoing. We're going to be hearing, from the American Academy of Pediatrics, move to dismiss the case. Then which is not a surprise. We were anticipating that. That's what we often see, as I'm sure you know, in all of these cases. We see motions to dismiss all of the time. The other piece is a case that was filed, and that case is filed in the district court in the District of Columbia, federal court. The other case was filed in district court, federal court again, in Massachusetts. And it's the American Academy of Pediatrics and some other organizations filing a lawsuit against Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Secretary of HHS, concerning a whole series of decisions that have been made by the secretary, people, other people in HHS, the ACIP committee, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, which is under the CDC. And in that case, we moved Children's Health Defense and several of the plaintiffs from our case against the American Academy of Pediatrics, moved to intervene in that case. Okay. And we thought it was really important to do that because we felt like there was information that was not being shared either by the plaintiffs or the defendants in that case, that it was important for the court to hear, because there are real life impacts of all of these decisions that are being discussed in that case. It's not just whether or not a committee was appropriately convened, whether people were placed on that committee appropriately, whether someone had the authority to change immunization schedules outside of that committee. It really gets down to families who have lost children, yes, or had their children seriously injured as a result of what the immunization schedule had been, particularly prior to January of this year. So we wanted that to be heard. The court unfortunately denied that, and we have appealed that denial. We have also appealed the preliminary injunction that the court issued just a couple of weeks ago, which rolled back a lot of these key decisions that really had the best interest of and the health of America's children at heart.
Kim, I think a lot of people are confused. You have doctors, researchers, scientists, developers of the mRNA platform themselves, on this committee, Robert Malone. You have a lot of educated people in medicine working to say, hey, there's a problem. How can a judge in Massachusetts unilaterally just yank all of their decision-making process because he doesn't agree with the political party that they were nominated by?
So he had some arguments to support his position aside from that, but really what it came across to me was this suggestion that somehow those doctors and scientists were not qualified to make these decisions. And when you really dig in and you boil it down, they're not qualified because they didn't believe in the status quo, or they believe that it was okay to challenge the status quo and determine whether it's right or wrong, right? It's no one saying, well, this is the only way it can be. It's let's look at what we're doing. Let's see if that's scientifically supportable. And if it's not, let's make some changes. And that's exactly what this committee was doing. And, the charter of the ACIP has to be renewed every couple of years, and it's time for the ACIP charter renewal. And now they are pulling into that, toxicologists and biostatisticians and the traditional, pediatrics and epidemiology that's always been there, but making it explicit that there are scientific fields of study, the members of whom are those who practice in those areas, that are appropriate to have on the ACIP to look at this decision-making process, right? It's important.
Right.
Someone who really understands toxicology, who understands biostatistics, who understands epidemiology, and important to have people who are not conflicted in their decision-making process. Prior iterations of ACIP were really heavy on people who had very serious conflicts of interest, including in the pharmaceutical industry. So, if you want to talk about whether or not you have an appropriately constituted ACIP, I think we can go back and look at some of those prior iterations and really call into question whether some of those people were appropriate to be serving on that committee.
When I started digging in a lot of this stuff, that was one of the most shocking things, was how easily they would approve things with zero evidence as to any benefit.
Right. Or I remember watching an ACIP meeting once, and they were talking about, I think it was cardiac. I may be misremembering this, but I think it was a cardiac concern about a vaccine. One guy said, I'm a little worried about the data that's showing X, Y, and Z. And then he still voted for it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Was that the one where they were like, do we have any data for that? And they were like, no, we don't. Approved.
Yeah, I think that's a different one. But yes, I mean, that's the thing that you watch it as a lay person, right? And, not a member of the committee, but someone interested in the issues. And you see the decision-making so-called process, which to me isn't really even a process. And it was just shocking to me over and over, what would get approved on very little information.
It's shocking that they did that, and it's shocking that we are now in a situation where it's somehow a legal decision over the health of families and children. It's unbelievable. I want to go into the judge, Brian Murphy, from Massachusetts. Now, are you directly dealing with his cases, or how is this working?
So Rick Jaffe is the one who's representing CHD and the other parties in the case. And as I said, we moved to intervene in that case to ask to be considered a party. The court denied that motion.
And that was Brian Murphy.
Was Brian Murphy. But he did ask us to submit an amicus brief. So we were hopeful that he was going to really take some of these issues to heart. Unfortunately, his decision ultimately didn't do that. And it was a great opportunity for us to get a lot of information, both in our intervention papers and in our amicus brief before the court. But it ultimately didn't sway the court, unfortunately. And it should have.
Is there any way to appeal that?
Yes, we have filed an appeal in that case. We filed a notice of appeal right away. and then filed our appellate brief within the past couple of days, asking the court to do two things. One, to overturn the decision on our intervention and allow us to intervene. And this is with the First Circuit Court of Appeals, which oversees appeals from the district court in Massachusetts. And then also to overturn the granting of the preliminary injunction, because you're 100% right. What has happened here is that one judge in one district court has essentially brought to a halt a lot of healthcare decision-making in the federal government.
Now, where does this appeal go to?
So that appeal goes to the First Circuit Court of Appeals. That's where it is now. It was just filed there. HHS, it's my understanding they're also going to appeal
They are.
the decision. They have not filed an appeal yet. But we're waiting to see, what they do there. I'm hopeful that they will in fact file that appeal. It's my understanding that they've indicated they will, but they haven't done it yet. And the part of me that is, really mission driven by what we do at Children's Health Defense is I would like to get a decision on this, get this moving. If it has to go up higher to the Supreme Court, how do we make that happen so that we can get back to the business of figuring out, how can we have healthier children in this country? Because we have, you've seen all the statistics about how unhealthy children are. And we spend the most money per capita on healthcare out of all of the sort of our peer high resource countries. And we have the worst health outcomes. We have terrible infant mortality. Our infant mortality is on par with some very low resource countries. That should not be the case, especially in this day and age where we have all the tools at hand to help people get healthier. And not all of those are medical tools, but there are, in fact, many of them aren't. They should be, right? Food is medicine, good food. But we see, and this is an old study, and I can only imagine the numbers have gotten worse. Over 50% of America's children have at least one chronic health condition, and often multiple chronic health conditions. And, what we're seeing, and we brought this out in our RICO complaint, is the pharmaceutical industry, which largely funds the American Academy of Pediatrics, and the American Academy of Pediatrics is a huge proponent of what was the vaccine schedule before January 5th, and before the COVID shot was taken off the schedule last summer, and what the schedule is now, which is rolling back to that with this preliminary injunction. They huge proponents of that. They get a lot of their funding from the pharmaceutical industry. They have toolkits online about how to encourage families to vaccinate.
Right. Yeah.
But meanwhile, the pharmaceutical industry, which is manufacturing all these vaccines, is also either developing or buying smaller biotech companies who develop medications to treat all these chronic health conditions that we're seeing. So it's that, customers for life model, right? You get something, it gives you a condition, you get a drug to treat that condition, and then maybe you get a side effect from that drug, and then there's another drug. I don't watch network television. I don't have cable. I don't have any of those things. But when I'm somewhere where someone like my mom has a TV with network TV, I'm astounded watching the drug commercials, right? I'm like, oh, here's a drug to treat your depression. Well, but if you have a side effect from that drug, then here's a drug to treat that side effect. And it's compounding, and younger children are being placed on multiple medications, which many of them may have to be on for life. And it's really unfortunate. And we're seeing, we've seen it for a long time in the elderly population, right? We know that elderly people are on, I've seen numbers anywhere from 12 to 18 prescription medications on average. But now we're seeing little kids on multiple prescription medications. And one of the pieces of information that came out in the Boston case through declarations, as doctors were saying, well, this new vaccination schedule is terrible because we're harmed by it. because it's going to require us to take the time to talk to have a conversation with our patients about vaccination and vaccines and potential side effects, etc. And each visit is going to take longer. And then we're going to be able to see fewer patients a day, and therefore we'll make less money. It all boiled down to the money. And it was just the hubris that they could even think that that was an okay position to take.
Informed consent is hard.
Yeah.
Gee whiz.
We have to talk to our patients about medical care. No, we should. Yeah. And the flip side of that is, of course, it implies that those conversations generally don't happen. And we know there are some great pediatricians out there who are having those conversations. But, almost every pediatrician in America belongs to the American Academy of Pediatrics. They have something like 67,000 members, right? They're huge. They've grown from a very tiny entity at its inception to this really huge, powerful trade organization for doctors is really what it is. It's not, it's not the health of children ultimately. Unfortunately, they try to put that face on it, but it really comes down to things like, are doctors making enough money? They have toolkits for doctors about how to, maximize income in your practices. That's what they are fundamentally about.
I feel like the dental model is a few years ahead of where regular medicine is going. They developed programs like suddenly everybody needed root scaling, right? What's that? It's where you have to deaden the nerves and come in and they have to really surgically scrape. And it all seemed really preposterous. If you'd go to an older dentist who didn't do these sort of revenue generating procedures, they would have said, the only time I ever needed any patient to have root scaling was when it was like a child with Down syndrome who was 19 who never brushed her teeth her whole life.
Mm-hmm.
But instead everybody's being diagnosed with this, and it's a very profitable system. So no surprise that this pediatric medicine is now pursuing that, and you can see the dark fruits of that seed with the gender mutilation surgeries. Used to be in this country, it was illegal to do female circumcision, which is essentially similar in vein to, but maybe even not even as bad as what they do now. So they've profitized that. Like they've got $5 billion for these transitions.
It's a huge number. And we just saw, actually, I was very happy to see, because it comes down really on the correct side of free speech here, a decision by the Supreme Court last week in a case that was not a CHD case.
Colorado, right?
Yes, Childs against Salazar, where in an 8-1 decision, the court said, you can't have viewpoint discrimination like this Colorado law has, where someone can't even talk about the flip side of just gender affirming care and have any sort of discussion about whether or not that's appropriate, etc. I mean, it was such a blatant viewpoint discrimination. To have an 8-1 decision out of this court is really pretty spectacular. And we have 2 cases that are right now up before the Supreme Court, waiting for decisions on cert petitions that CHD is either party to or has supported. And Rick is the lawyer in both of those too. We work with Rick a lot and very well with him. But we have a case that's called Corey against Bonta. It's Dr. Pierre Corey, which many of your viewers probably know.
Sure.
And that case is out of California. There had been an earlier case that we were involved in when California passed a law that basically said, if you're not going to support the main narrative that the government is espousing, both state and federal, with respect to the COVID narrative and treatments for COVID, you're going to get a slap on the wrist or more. Your license is at risk from that, much more than a slap on the wrist. And that case, so we had this case. We got it in. We got the law enjoined right away. And that case then California repealed the law. So big win. But they came back using general standard of care statutes to try to argue that the same speech is still not allowed. And
I was in California for that, and it was a disaster. Doctors were fleeing the state. I knew several that left. They were like, there's no point in being here. Let's go to Arizona.
Yep. No, I think, that's happened. And for different reasons, we saw a lot of doctors leave New York State when they weren't given, and other medical professionals, when they weren't given religious exemptions to vaccination. Right. We lost a huge number, especially in upstate New York, which is underserved medically as it was. Ambulances were having to travel across state lines to get people care because there wasn't enough staff. But in California, they started using then the regular standard of care laws to say that this speech was still prohibited. So we brought the Corey case, and we're not successful in getting an injunction at the trial court level. We appealed. We lost in the Ninth Circuit. Again, this is all in federal court. So we went up to the Supreme Court last year and filed a writ petition, which still hasn't been decided. It's the only case, to our knowledge, out of the over 6,000 petitions for writ of certiorari that were filed last term in the court that was not decided. But by then the court knew, and it's reading tea leaves a little bit, but the court knew that Childs was coming down the pike too.
Yeah.
So we're waiting to see, and then we have another case called Stockton against Ferguson, which has some doctors involved and doctor speech involved, but also the named plaintiff, first named plaintiff in that case is John Stockton. And he is suing because he has a right as a citizen, even as a patient, to hear information that may be contradictory to, the main narrative that's out there. So that's an element of the First Amendment that people sometimes forget about. It's not just your ability to speak and express opinions and share information. We all have rights as listeners too, to receive that information. And that's how we make informed decisions. I don't have to agree with everything. If I only read things that I agreed with, what am I learning and how am I growing from that? And where's my critical thinking going? And we're destroying critical thinking skills in our young people for sure. But the Stockton case will be fully briefed for the court to conference and make a decision on that writ petition. So we're waiting on both Corey and Stockton, which now I believe, and Childs is out there with that great decision about medical speech and professional speech, and that speech is entitled to the same protections as other speech, not a lesser protection. And they applied strict scrutiny to the state of Colorado, and we just had that one Justice Jackson out there by herself disagreeing and and apparently so mad that she felt,
bless her heart,
she felt the need to read her opinion into her dissenting opinion from the bench, which is really, really extraordinary. But Justice Jackson also in the Murphy v. Missouri case, what had been Missouri v. Biden, when oral arguments were held in that case, she made a statement, and this is not going to be a direct quote, but it was something like, well, if we allow this to happen and we allow all this, if we say that the government can't basically work with social media to do this, it's really going to hamstring the government. And all I could do was put my palm over my face and go, that's what the First Amendment is supposed to do. The First Amendment is supposed to, help protect the citizens' right to free speech. And you do that by limiting government interference.
Yeah. I spoke at a link with a doctor this weekend, and I was like, what would it take for you to enjoy the practice of medicine again? And a lot of it is just remove the government from anything to do with it. The over involvement actually backfires. as is often the case. Anytime as Reagan said, the most frightening sound in the world is someone saying, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help."
No,
Um,
it hasn't even become, it's not even the practice of medicine anymore. It is, and I think, going back to the AAP case in Boston and those doctors' declarations, right? It's the business of medicine. And
yes,
that doctors who truly believe in the practice of medicine and the healing arts, I think are incredibly upset and incredibly frustrated by, what the restrictions placed on them by the government, by insurance companies, et cetera. And it makes it very hard to be a good doctor.
right. Well, you've got, there last week we were covering on a lot of people were covering on Twitter the role of foreign residents taking residency spots in our hospitals. These are people who maybe have different education system for becoming doctors. MBBS is what it's called overseas. So that's, you've got people who are afraid to speak up because they could lose their visa status.
Hmm.
The hospitals like that. They really want doctors that do their job and shut up, operate like robots. So it's made it more difficult to form a consensus on something that might be provocative, right, in medicine. So it's really commendable for all of the doctors that have spoken up, like Pierre Corey and Malone and all the different ones. And there's always these factions warring against each other on our side, which is always interesting to
Yep.
watch. But we just duck and get through it. But going back to the judges. How do you perceive the judiciary at this moment in the United States, both federal and state?
I would say, you can always say, well, so-and-so didn't make a good decision. So we saw so many poor decisions, I believe, coming out of the COVID, especially early COVID years. And there were lawsuits we had to bring awareness of, if nothing else. Because strategically, we knew, a lot of those lawsuits weren't going to win.
Yeah.
And in part, that's because we have to remember that judges, they are human beings, right? And especially those early days, many, many people were operating just from a place of fear, right? They weren't sure what was going to happen to them. They weren't sure what was going to happen to their family members. And in operating from that place of fear, no judge wanted to be the first judge to make a decision that, you didn't have to get the vaccine, you didn't have to wear a mask, you didn't have to social distance, because no one wanted to be the judge who was accused of killing grandma. That's really in my mind, what it boiled down to. So we got many decisions that were just legally, I think, poor decisions that did not comport with what the law actually said, because judges were afraid. And then that started to slowly unravel and change a little bit. And we've seen some good decisions. Unfortunately, some of those good decisions now that we're seeing are coming on the heels of really, really bad decisions, right? So people who lost their jobs because they refused to take a COVID vaccine or wear a mask or whatever it is they were being required to do. So some of those people are now winning judgments, but they still lost their job.
Right.
We had cases like that in New York State, including cases for healthcare workers. These people were out of work, or maybe they had to leave the state that they live in to go somewhere else where they could work. And we saw, crazy things happening. I had heard a story, and I'm sure this person is not the only one. A woman was a nurse. She refused, she worked at a hospital. She refused to take a COVID vaccine. They fired her. She became basically a traveling nurse. She got hired back by that same hospital, and she didn't have to take the vaccine. She's like, I'm the same person. I'm just coming to you as a contractor now versus being an employee. And, where is the sense in that, right? That just doesn't make sense. And there were so many people who were, they're just blatant religious discrimination, sometimes based on what religion you were.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you're Catholic, the Pope is saying it's okay to go get the vaccine. So why won't you do it if the Pope says it's okay? Well,
Right.
It's my personal relationship with God. And the Pope has his relationship with God. My personal relationship with God lands somewhere else on this issue. So we're seeing better decisions happening now, but they're not all good. Like, I think this decision out of Boston was flat out wrong. And, hoping that the First Circuit, or if necessary, the Supreme Court, sees that as well, and that the government can, again, get back to the business of what it's supposed to be doing.
And that goes to an issue. Many of these judges, I believe, were appointed specifically to oppose Trump. And I you wouldn't want it to be that way, but this specific judge, Brian Murphy, has already had his decisions overturned by the Supreme Court, and then he referenced the dissent and still pursuing his overturned cases, which is insane. It's just a rebellious judge at this point. So now here he comes again with another important case. I thought these cases were randomly assigned to judges, right? Isn't that supposed to be how it is?
Well, generally speaking, yes. I don't know exactly what goes on in the clerk's office. I don't think they're spinning a wheel or anything, but
not like in Billions.
No. Who knows? I could be wrong. Who knows what goes on? Sometimes if you have a case that is related to another case that's already before a judge, you're going to assign it to that judge just for, expediency and efficiency. But they're looking, I think they look at a lot of things when they're making these assignments. And that includes things like what your caseload looks like, and, what you can take on, you sometimes get in situations where judges get really backed up on their dockets because they've got, especially if they're doing, this happens, I think, sometimes like down in the DC circuit, where there are a lot of federal criminal matters as well, federal crimes that are being adjudicated, and it happens in other districts too. But you can have a judge who has a very active criminal calendar, and civil matters become challenging for that judge because there are time limits on things you have to do criminally, right? That don't necessarily, you have to have, justice is supposed to be swifter in the criminal realm than it is in the civil realm. And civil cases, and this is the other downside of this, is that civil cases just drag on sometimes a really long time, years and years and years. And there sometimes, that is because you have a judge who doesn't move their docket quickly. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's the parties dragging out discovery. Sometimes it's a combination of things. It's a lot of motion practice, depends on how complex the case is. Yeah. But, there are cases that go on for a decade. It's not, everyone thinks, oh, we're going to get, we filed a case, now we're going to get a decision. It doesn't always happen that way. In fact, I think it's less likely to happen that way than, well, here's a decision a year or two from now, and then it gets appealed, and a year or two from now, you get a decision. So it can sometimes be frustrating, and it's frustrating for lawyers too. But people sometimes think that a lawsuit's been filed and that's it. We're going to have a resolution really fast.
I want to play a clip from Chuck Schumer discussing some of these judges that they nominated and the purpose of why they were nominated and brought in.
Oh, this will be great. I haven't seen this.
Yeah, this was on, let's see, Newsmax, I think. 1 second.
Oh. 135 judges. The good news here is we did put 235 judges, progressive judges, judges not under the control of Trump last year on the bench, and they are ruling against Trump time after time after time. And we hope that the appellate courts, when it gets up there, and the Supreme Court will uphold those rulings.
I mean, you said it.
So yeah, I don't need to go into
Yeah,
the
no, I
Newsmax.
mean, yeah, it's when you feel like you can be so blatant about that too, that's really concerning. They're not trying to hide anything, right? They're
Right.
this is what the judges are going to do, and that's where timing becomes important too, right? Because it's not just the judges really acting as, at that point, political advocates.
Yeah.
But if you can put off decisions for a long time too, you may achieve the same result.
This is I'm going to chastise the Republicans a little bit about this. Brian Murphy was confirmed by the Senate in December of 2024 after the election, and multiple Republican senators did not vote. And they could have shot him down. And I remember people were very upset. Like, why are they letting all these judges go through? Vance and Rubio and those guys, they need to be back in the Senate shooting it down, and they weren't. And now these chickens are coming home to roost. You don't want to think that a judge would do that, but at some point, and you're an officer of the court, so I'm not going to push you too hard on that. But at some point, for me as a citizen, and my other plebeian colleagues, we are concerned by seeing this behavior. We want to know that our courts are impartial, and when they perform in a manner that contradicts that assumption, it disenfranchises everyone in the system of government that we have.
Right, and these are very serious, and I'm not talking about Murphy here specifically at all, but generally these are they're very serious appointments. You're asking someone to be a federal judge. These should be very high quality, very high caliber people who make decisions based on what the law is. But there's a saying out there that courts follow culture. So, and when I was talking about, what we saw in the early days of COVID, that's what it was, right? The courts were followed. It was fearful. Everyone was scared. Many people, in their homes. I remember saying, this has nothing to do with the law, but I was sitting reading a book one evening, and I was sitting at a window that overlooks my street, and I see this family come walking down the street, and they're clearly a family. Little boy, maybe 5, 6 years old. They're all wearing masks.
Surgical masks?
Yes.
So they were all surgeons.
That's right. They were all that was my son in the background. They were all, 6 feet apart. I don't know what he's doing. They were all 6 feet apart walking down the street, and they would stop every few feet and talk to one another.
Yeah.
And I was like, why are we doing this? Like, do you not all live in the same house? Or are you suggesting to me that in your house, you're all like this too? And that's fear. I mean, that's just outright fear that is governing their lives. So, we saw a lot of that with the idea of courts following culture. And we're seeing it now too, as things change somewhat, right? We're seeing some decisions that are coming down, and they're being decided in accordance with the law, because the culture is changing too. Now, but we are unfortunately still seeing some very politicized decisions from courts, which is it's disappointing. And this is, I would say the same thing if it were a Democratic president and a Republican judge. The same.
Oh, everything's backwards. Everything is so crazy right now.
Yeah.
I used to think that, Republicans are going to be more institutionalists. They're going to be more about, big military and things like that. Now we're living in a world where the hippies are the ones pushing the shots and everything. I'm so confused.
It's and the other thing I say is, I was for many, many, many years a registered Democrat. And, that's what I registered as when I was 18.
Yeah.
And over especially the past 8 years or so, the Democratic Party and their relationship to the First Amendment it seems to have done, a complete 180-degree turn, and they are no longer proponents of free speech, but they're quashing free speech left and
Right.
right when it doesn't agree with them. And you know, I'm like, that was not the Democratic Party I signed up for when I was 18, and I was never a strict party line voter or anything, but I was like, that's just, to me, completely antithetical to what the Democratic Party should believe in. And you know, you see organizations like ACLU saying things too that I'm like, wait, what happened to the, you know, the Klan marching on, or the Nazis marching in Skokie and things like that? You used to stand up for
Hmm.
free speech, and it really, I mean, the issues go so far beyond, you know, just, well, should someone be able to say this or that? And obviously there are some limits on speech, right? You're
Sure.
yelling fire in a crowded theater example. But those are rare. Those are rare exceptions to free speech. But what we saw, you know, during COVID was the inability to talk or write or publish in many instances about real issues that were going on and real science that was being done and real treatments that were working and helping to save people's lives.
Correct.
And if you didn't know where to go to get that information, you had no idea
Yeah.
that it was out there. If all you saw was ivermectin is horse medicine, because that's what the FDA said on, you know, on X one day,
Right.
then that's what you know. But you are not getting the information to critically assess whether or not this is something you want to talk to your doctor about, because you're reading stories that it's helping people, and you're reading the horse pace, you know, the horse medicine story, and how you weigh those. And it's also it's destroying the ability to think critically because people aren't given a variety of viewpoints. But it's also, to me, like just very much creating a nanny state where the government is deciding what you can hear. Like, I'm sorry, you know, average citizen, you're not smart enough to assess whether this is, you know, a topic that, you know, you might want to form an opinion on. So we're just going to give you what your opinion is. That's just wrong.
You know, the country folk had been giving horses ivermectin for decades. And, you know, when my mom was a child in the country, you know, the vets would come around and treat the animals, and they'd give the kids stuff too, because they would be exposed to the same things the animals were. No one got upset about it. They didn't, you know, put tweet. Well, they didn't have Twitter at the time, but what smoke signals or whatever they did back then. You know, it was just a common knowledge kind of thing. And I find it to be interesting that the cities seem to be more about this mind control than the rural areas. And it's difficult when you do try to talk to someone within that realm. They're gonna their first thing is they're gonna get angry with you if you mention anything about ivermectin, for example. I posted something about the state of Georgia is passing a law making ivermectin over the counter. And some city people got on and they were like, for what purpose? And I'm like, well, the practice of medicine. You know, they don't realize that the pharmaceutical companies and the pharmacy schools have all scared pharmacists or politicized it in some instances, so that pharmacists will not fill prescriptions for patients, even in a situation where it's a very safe dosage. I mean, the amounts of ivermectin you'd have to take would be even bigger than the tube of horse paste to
Right.
cause any kind of harm. So what do? They run to Google, and they find, basically Google just provides them, you know, 3 or 4 studies that they can just paste that they've never read. They don't care. They're just trying to shut you down because they don't want you talking about these things. It upsets them that you talk about them. Hydroxychloroquine was a great example.
Yeah.
They only needed the studies to last for a few weeks before they got retracted or shot down, so that they could change the discourse of the country to hate it. And then once
Right.
that's done, people aren't going to see the retraction, or they don't care.
Exactly.
So there's no ramification for the people that did those fake studies. There's no punishment. Sapan Desai, the only reason he lost his medical license in Ohio, he did the Surgisphere hydroxychloroquine study, was because he refused to show up and discuss anything to the board. And they were like, well, if you're not going to show up, we're going to get rid of your license.
Yeah.
And I think that was in Illinois. So when there's no ramifications, you talk about screaming fire in a theater. Saying a drug based on tonic water is deadly also should be kind of considered a criminal act, especially in a period of time when it maybe could have helped people. I wanted to, yeah.
Oh, go ahead. I was just
no,
going
you
to
go
say,
ahead.
I was going to say, one of the, we were talking about the high cost of healthcare at the top of the show. And one of the things that's really a tragedy to me is hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin are super inexpensive and super effective for most people. Now, obviously, they're going to be, they're going to be people for whom they're contraindicated, as there is with everything. But the way they were using remdesivir, for example, which is so much more expensive, really not helpful to most people with COVID, but so expensive, and how it just became the standard of care. We're gonna ventilate you, and we're gonna give you remdesivir. Whoever was making ventilators in those early years made a literal killing in the ventilator market. Because I really wonder about how much damage mechanical ventilation did to a lot of people's lungs too.
Well, once you got on it, you had what? You had a 14% survival rate once you get on there for more than 48 hours.
But I don't know if you remember, there was a young guy. He was an ER physician, I think in Brooklyn, New York, who, maybe it was the Bronx. It was one of the outer boroughs, who said, we're ventilating these people, and it's not that their lungs don't work. They need oxygen. They don't need mechanical ventilation. So I'm thinking, what happens when you're forcing air into someone who doesn't need air forced into them? Does that damage the lungs? Why aren't we just giving people supplemental oxygen if that's really what they need? But it was, that became the standard of care, right? So people weren't being adequately assessed for even the propriety of giving remdesivir. I know a story of someone who was a kidney transplant recipient. Remdesivir is
bad for the kidneys.
Really bad for the kidneys. And they put this woman on remdesivir, and she passed away because that was the standard of care. Even though, had a doctor critically assess that, I don't think she was a candidate for remdesivir at all.
And you had Nicole Siratek, a nurse who was a traveling nurse in New York at the time, coming out and speaking about these things. And she suffered significant attacks on her nursing licenses, on her reputation. I mean, she had to change her name. Like that, she went through a real nightmare. And we covered a lot of how these doctors were targeted by groups that received funding from Bio, the pharmaceutical lobbyist company, and then they were turning around and giving Facebook $400,000 to promote their stuff. It really is horrible what's happened. But I want to get back to something before we end. You mentioned that when you want to enjoin your case with the ACIP case, right? You wanted to bring new information.
Yes.
Let's discuss that new information, because my understanding, it was the vaccine injured and killed that we're going to finally have some voice in a government.
Well, and they are all plaintiffs in litigation, like our RICO case, right? So that's against AAP and their unnamed co-conspirators. And I would, if anyone wants an hour or two of light reading, our complaint in the RICO case, I think, is really so good, and it details everything and has a citation for everything. So if someone really wants to follow what's happened with the American Academy of Pediatrics and things that have happened, at the CDC and the Institute of Medicine, and just the whole history of it is laid out really masterfully. I mean, the model for the RICO case against AAP is really very similar to the RICO case against big tobacco. As we've said, the only thing that not the only thing, obviously there are differences, but one of the major differences, we talked before about how you're creating people as customers for life, right? Because they need a drug to solve this problem and then another drug to solve that problem created by the first drug is, so the industry is just really capitalizing and profiting on this. But the tobacco players, at least they didn't go around opening oncology clinics to treat the lung cancer that smoking caused, right? We're doing this customers for life model with big pharma, et cetera, and promoting these drugs. So yes, so we asked to join in as another party. Our lawsuit against AAP still stands on its own, but we asked to also be a party in that case in Boston, the case that Judge Murphy is overseeing. And among the people who wanted to join were two families who lost children. One family lost twins shortly after vaccinating according to the recommended schedule at the time. And this little boy and little girl there was a family history of vaccine injury. I believe their dad or someone on their dad, I think it was their dad or someone on their dad's side of the family had a pretty significant adverse reaction. They told mom, and I think she went with her mother-in-law, if I'm correct, to the pediatrician for that appointment, told the doctor. The doctor was dismissive of it, or whoever the medical professional was overseeing that visit was dismissive of the injury. The children got sick afterwards. They were taken to get medical treatment, and and then when they passed away, that family is still under investigation from the police concerning the deaths of those babies. And then the other family is a little girl who was 12 months old. And the family was going to be traveling to go visit other family in another state, I believe. And they were in New York State. Went to the doctor. The baby was a little bit behind on her vaccination schedule, right? This was a family who was vaccinating according to the schedule. Baby, I think, maybe had been sick for the last visit, so was behind. So they did a catch-up schedule where she got, I think, at least if you do the math, it's going to be more than 12 antigens, but basically 12 they come in combo form now. So it's hard to pull them out. But, if you want to talk about Prevnar 23 or whatever, we can talk about 23 different antigens, but basically 12 different diseases. And also was given fluoride for her teeth at the time. So then the family goes, and she was a little sniffly. She wasn't super sick, but she was a little sniffly, but the medical professionals again said it was fine. Parents are trusting what the medical professionals are saying. The family and their other siblings, older siblings, gets in their car to go where they're going. And as they're driving, the baby starts having seizures. And they pull over and call, the police come, they bring an ambulance, the baby's taken to the hospital, and eventually the baby passed away. And again, a 1-year-old. And there were signs, we understand, of like brain swelling, classic potentially vaccine-induced encephalopathy. But what these families and other families hear all the time is, we don't know, sudden unexpected infant death. We don't know what caused this sudden unexpected death, but we'll tell you it's not the vaccines. Now, how you just automatically rule out the vaccines is one of the great mysteries of life, because that should certainly, you should look at everything that happened around that child in that time period. What were they exposed to? And how can you just say it's not the vaccines? Because there's this narrative, and we address this again in our RICO case, that vaccines are safe and effective. And everyone's just supposed to believe that hook, line, and sinker. But the reality is testing on individual vaccines in clinical trials is abysmal. We know that reported injuries to the vaccine adverse event reporting system, VAERS, represent really the tiniest tip of the iceberg. There was a Harvard Pilgrim study that said something like 1% of injuries get reported to VAERS. Yet there are many, many reports in VAERS. We know that the vaccine injury compensation program, because you can't sue the manufacturers, you have to go through a federal compensation program where you sue the government, has paid out billions of dollars in vaccine injury. And again,
Right.
tip of the iceberg, because they don't know about the program. They get precluded from the program because there is such a short window to file. It's even worse for COVID vaccines. So we know the individual testing isn't great. But what we also know is that the schedule as a whole has never been tested for safety. And the Institutes of Medicine have at least twice told the powers that be that should be doing this testing that you need to test the entire schedule. And that has just been ignored year after year. And then the schedule change has historically, more and more is added to the schedule, just compounding the potential risks that are, again, going untested, but parents are told it's safe and effective.
There was some excitement going into this ACIP meeting. I wanted to attend. I couldn't get anybody to sneak me in there. But finally, these vaccine-injured families were going to get a chance to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is probably the worst part of all of it from what Murphy did, Judge Murphy, was that he denied the rights of citizens their ability to redress their grievances. And probably one of the only forums where they could do it and have a meaningful effect. So my hope is that you guys win these cases. Maybe it has to go all the way up to the Supreme Court if that's what needs to happen. And Murphy gets slapped down again. If they need to tweak the way they brought in members of the ACIP committee, okay, fine. That's a different issue than not allowing these people to speak.
Well, and I think I said this earlier, the language and how, the treatment of the ACIP members, even in the judge's opinion.
Yeah.
I feel like it was really unfair. These are highly credentialed people. No one went out into the sidewalk of Washington, D.C. and grabbed some people and just said, hey, you want to sit on this, federal government committee? I don't care if you make cupcakes for a living. You can just come in and, you'll make some decisions. These are highly, highly credentialed people, and they were really dismissed. And I think unfortunate doesn't even begin to cover it, but a really unfortunate decision. And as you said, families had ripped away from them an opportunity to share information. And there are other outlets for families. We often feature, unfortunately, families who have been impacted by vaccine injury and death on CHD TV and in the Defender. But, to get those stories out where people could see it on C-SPAN or wherever would really be great too. I mean, I think that our voices are getting louder, and I think there are more people who are starting to question vaccine safety and efficacy and asking those questions. And that clearly makes doctors, makes the AAP very uncomfortable.
Right.
To have people ask those questions and have to, and they make less money, John. I mean, they'll make less money. But, informed consent is so critical and like a hallmark of modern medicine. And it's absolutely been trampled. And it's not just informed consent. It's also informed refusal, right? You should have the right to refuse an intervention.
Right.
I don't care whether it's a vaccine or someone wants to take out one of your kidneys, to go back to our kidney example. You get to decide whether or not you want to have that happen to your body. Do I want to take a particular drug? I often worry, sometimes people say, as we're getting all these systems integrating, right, and information out there, I know plenty of people who say, well, I went to the doctor and they prescribed me a statin, but there's no way I'm taking a statin. So I have this prescription that I'm never going to fill. Now they can figure, now we've got systems in place where you can tell who's filling, the prescription is written. It's probably digital, it's sent to the pharmacy. They ask you where your pharmacy is. You don't ever go pick it up Well, now they know you didn't take your statin. And is that going to be used to discriminate against people in either obtaining health insurance if they want it, or the rates that they have to pay for health insurance, or the treatment they get down the line at a hospital because, oh, well, you're here for, you know, you need to have your arteries cleaned out because, well, you didn't take your statin, did you? Right? You know, that the whole system is really, in many respects, in a frightening way, setting itself up for people to be compliant and to
Yeah.
be punished if they're not compliant.
I always feel like if you want to look at who the bad guy is, look at who is trying to silence speech.
Hmm.
That's the first place I start. But we are at an hour now. So, Kim, I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your day to tell us about this. I'm sorry Warner couldn't be here. He sends his hellos. But
Well, right back at him.
okay. Well, thank you so much for everything. And please come back and let us know how your cases progress, or Rick's cases progress.
Oh, I'd be happy to do that.
All right. Well, have a wonderful day.
Thanks. You